This is me at 6 or 7 with 2 box turtles, and well, I thought I'd begin by telling you how my life as an adventurer and explorer began. Like a lot of young boys, all my best adventures began with Playboy magazine. My father kept his Playboy magazines on the top shelf of a secretary in our den. And when he was gone, the babysitter wasn't looking, I would climb up on his dresser, and then, or climb up on his chair, and then climb up and pull the magazines down and read the articles. And so you can imagine. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about that life. In my neighborhood, we traded reptiles like baseball cards. Normal kids trade baseball cards. Box turtles like this might get you a fence swift. A couple of fence swifts might get you a king snake. If you had a king snake, you were the top of the heap. So next to Playboy magazine, reptiles were in. So imagine what it was like for me 30 years later to be on assignment for Playboy magazine, to investigate the world's biggest reptile import-export company, this company, Strictly Reptiles. I walked into Strictly, so because my last talk was a little depressing, I'm going to tell you some of the color that I didn't share in the last discussion of Strictly Reptiles. Last time I was here, I had finished this investigation, and I talked about it a little bit. I walked in here on the first day. This is a company that is bringing in reptiles from all over the world. Largest reptile import-export company in the world. If you've seen a reptile in a pet shop over the last 30 years, chances are 1 in 2 that it came through this company. The owner, the founder of the company, was part of the Tabrawi narcotics organization operating out of Miami. So it had a dark past as well as a reptile trafficking past. I walked in, I introduced myself to the owner, Mike Van Ostrom, and then behind me was Mike's father, Ray Van Ostrom. He has a shaved head, he looks like Telly Savalas from back in the day with gold chains and an open shirt. And I hear him on the phone. He's calling someone, he's saying, you better get over here and bring something. And he's part of the narcotics organization. Mario Tabrawi, back in the day, found an informant in his midst. That informant was shot. Mario took a circular saw and sawed the man's head off and his arms and legs off. And so this guy behind me is saying, you better get over here. And I'm getting nervous as I'm interviewing his son. Suddenly the door opens and a woman walks in, and she's holding a box. And she says, are you really from Playboy magazine? And I said, yeah, I'm here on assignment. She said, she turns to Mike and she says, Mike, can I show him? And Mike, I have no idea what's going on. And Mike starts to shake his head and puts his head down, and I realize, Mike, you got to let her show me. And Mike throws his hands up. She puts the box down and pulls off her top and says, do you think I can get into Playboy? It's maybe my best moment. I said, you know, we are a full-body magazine. Without a beat, she pulled her pants down. And she had a tattoo of a Playboy bunny on her hip. And so I have been asked many times, how did you get started as a wildlife crime investigator? And I tell many formal stories, but the true story is that day, the kid who grew up with box turtles and walked in and had someone take off their clothes within about a minute of my career beginning. That story ended up being a book called The Lizard King, and while I was writing that book, National Geographic called me and said, if you could do anything, what would you do? We want to do a story about wildlife trade. I said, I would go after this guy. His name is Anson Wong. He's a wildlife trafficking kingpin operating out of Southeast Asia. He's moving everything. He operates from a little island called Penang on the west coast of Malaysia, and he's moving all the things we care about when we think about wildlife. Snow leopards, Styx's macaw, rarest bird on Earth. Anson is supposed to be extinct in the wild. Anson had 4 of them. He was offering panda bear skins. He had a farm in Vietnam that was raising up tigers that he killed, had mounted by taxidermists, and he sold the mounted tigers. He was a bad guy. I said I would go after him. National Geographic said, okay, what do you need? I said, I just need time. Leave me alone and I'll be back to you. Okay. They'd never done a crime story before. So I went to work for Strictly Reptiles. I worked in the arachnid room, feeding and watering bird-eating tarantulas. I worked in the venomous room, that's a rhino viper, all of those little boxes. This is in Hollywood, Florida. All of those boxes are venomous snakes. Cobras, mambas, coral snakes. And people keep them as pets. That's a bird-eating tarantula. This is a giant python that was brought in because it got too big for its owner, who was a stripper in Miami, and loved the snake so much she couldn't bear to turn it in strictly, that the guy at the end is her husband, and he was tasked with bringing it in. That's the reptile world. That's the reptile legal world. The underworld is much more colorful. I went after Anson. I met his couriers. I met his customers. We pulled off an investigation called I called Operation Big Ego, going to everybody he knew, except for Anson, all around the world: Indonesia, Malaysia, California, Florida. So that when I walked into Anson's place and said, "I'm Bryan Christy," he said, "You should be talking to me. I'm the guy." That ended up, sorry, we lost our internet connection. That ended up being the cover story of National Geographic in 2010. And it had a major impact. In Malaysia, Anson was caught with some reptiles in a suitcase, and instead of getting away with it, as he had done for years, he was put in jail. The anti-corruption agency raided the government official that I named in the article as being Anson's sort of rabbi for shepherding illegal activity through Malaysia. Her office was raided. That department was reorganized. Anson's zoo was closed down, and his business licenses were seized. So it was an example. It was the first time National Geographic had done a crime story. And what I said to them is, you've been in the crime business for years. You've been telling stories of animal exploitation, but you've been doing it from a biologist's perspective. You've been showing wildlife exploited. We've got to change the structure of these stories. If we change the way we tell the stories, we can change the way people think about them. Let's start looking at these stories as Law and Order episodes. Law and Order is incredibly popular. People love crime stories. People hate, myself included, animal exploitation stories. I hate seeing the puppies, please donate to the Humane Society, please do this. I don't, obviously I care about the animals, but I can't bear to see sort of Sally Struthers doing that tearful thing. And people aren't going to watch or read an article, but they will invest in crime stories. And they had been doing crime stories for decades. You have an exploited animal, you have a villain. They just had not been spending enough time on the villain. And I'm trained, I was a lawyer before turning to journalism. My uncle was one of the FBI's first long-term undercover agents, and he's trained me for years. So we started approaching these stories as crime stories. So the next big question is, okay, we have a successful model, we've had an impact. What do we do next? Well, there's all sorts of wildlife exploited around the world. There are tigers in East Asia. There are pangolin, which is the spiny anteater, considered possibly the most trafficked animal on the planet. The scales are used for traditional Asian medicine. There are freshwater turtles being smuggled out of Southeast Asia. Monkeys for the pet trade. Bears being sedated and milked in Vietnam for their bile to be used in traditional Asian medicine. Birds in Indonesia, very open market, comical bird market in Jakarta. This is like an Italian market or Chinatown in any city. That's how packed with wildlife this is. This is where your Prada and Gucci shoes come from. This is the slaughterhouse. I was the first journalist to get inside and film
inside this place. This is shark fin soup, which has been popular in China in particular as a wedding soup. You celebrate major events, state dinners, for example, with shark fin soup. And orangutans are just an animal that I really love, and I had a chance to spend a good deal of time in Borneo with these animals, and they're also trafficked. So what do we do next? What do I take on next? What should National Geographic take on next, now that we have a model? I didn't know. I'm not a animal guy, I'm a crime guy and a lawyer. Then I heard Will Smith talk. He did an interview, and they said, you're the highest paid actor at the moment. What's your secret? And he said, I sat down with my agent. He said, it's not an accident. I sat down with my agent, and we looked at all the highest grossing films in the last 10 or 15 years. They're all science fiction. Let's go with science fiction. So you get Men in Black 2, Independence Day, boom, boom, boom. Will Smith is killing it. And I thought, what is the science fiction equivalent in the wildlife trade? If I can figure out what that animal is, I can get the kind of reach that Will Smith has. We had great success on the Anson Wong story, but it was a reptile story. And that has a limited audience. The Men in Black 2 of wildlife, to me, was the elephant. Extraordinary animal, as you know, they communicate across incredible distances through sounds and vibrations we can't hear. They have communities. The mother leads the herd. The males are generally separate, and the stored lines like an elephant never forgets aren't true. Elephants, if you take out the matriarch of a herd, remembers for decades paths to water that in times of drought are invisible. But remember, there's no water here at our usual spot. But decades ago, there was this route. That route is the path that the matriarch will lead her herd to. And so I said, let's do elephants. But I didn't know. I had only seen elephants in a zoo. And when we put our team together at National Geographic, I said, look, I don't need to see elephants. I'm following the money. I'm going to do this like an FBI investigation. And a friend of mine who's also a criminal investigator said to me, no, you need to go to Africa and you need to see these animals. I said, no. That's the problem with National Geographic. They get all dramatic and emotionally involved. I'm just following the money. Paper trails, corporate records. No, you need to see them. I went to Tanzania and spent time in Selous and Ruaha National Parks. And it was extraordinary. To be able to spend time with these animals can change your life. And I was committed to this work before that experience, but that did change my life. And so I came back and I said to the team, look, the core principle is correct. These are not animal stories anymore. These are crime stories. So here's what I want you to do. When you want to say the word elephant or ivory, I want you to use the word cocaine. And if you start saying cocaine when you want to say elephant, you're going to start framing the way we're going to go after this from now on in the right way. And it changed things. At the time, China, and still today, China is the big draw. Most ivory is going to China. This is worth tens of thousands of dollars, this carving. I was the first journalist, I think, to film inside the ivory carving factories in China. And they're set up like sweatshops. Booth, pneumatic sort of Dremel tool, art book open to a drawing of this, and you just sit there and reproduce this on pus. And so I'm thinking, how do I get in? How do I get into this world that I know nothing about? And I get a tip that the Vatican is buying ivory. That carvers in the Philippines are smuggling ivory out of Africa, carving it into religious figures, Madonna, Jesus, the Santo Niño, the Holy Child. And I said, okay, the Vatican's in the ivory game. That's a tip worth exploring. And so this is where that goes. American walked across the path, and we approached it, and then I turned, and just one tree deep was a herd of maybe 100 elephants. It was this magical moment. It wasn't to be close to these animals. It was that this society is right here, and I almost missed it. To understand the ivory trafficking problem, you need to understand the role of religion in driving ivory. The rumor was that ivory was being smuggled out of Africa to the Philippines, where Catholics were carving the ivory into Catholic images and smuggling out into the rest of the world. And if that was true, it would be a very interesting, small story. And then I went to Thailand. Everything I saw in the Catholic Church, I saw duplicated among Buddhists. I arrived in China. The first place the government took me was Master Li and Chu Ping, who were devout Buddhists and only carved Buddhist carvings. They're incredible sculptures, but you have high-end artists lined up in rows on a factory scale. Then I knew we were onto something. If you could get at what drives people to buy ivory for religious purposes, you have a chance to change their opinions, and that's something you very rarely have. You do have a series of disconnects between a love of an elephant and what's happening to get their ivory. Certainly the elephant monkey in Thailand is among the starkest examples of that. I was surprised that he made the jump from talking about ivory as a craft and ivory as an art form to so quickly jumping to, here's how to get it out of Africa. Yes, if you can do it, I'll take it. I think Americans probably have difficulty understanding the extent of ivory trafficking and the problems that it's causing. People are losing their lives over this, and religions are driving it. It seems to me there's an opportunity, given the deeper value systems, to make a difference, make a change.
So that was the story, that was the 2012 cover story of National Geographic, and the photographer you saw laying on the ground there was Brent Sturton, and he's the guy I've been working with for a long time. The impact of this story was extraordinary, even from my perspective. Just after the story ran, police in the Philippines raided the ivory carving factories that we went into. Police in Italy raided shops in Vatican City and Abruzzo. The then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton held up the story and asked for greater federal attention to the ivory issue. The Obama administration has subsequently created a cabinet-level wildlife trafficking task force. Never happened before. We have had elephant marches. We've had ivory crushes, countries destroying their entire ivory stocks. The United States, China destroying sort of a symbolic amount, Hong Kong a symbolic amount, but in an important act. France, it's just country after country destroying their ivory stocks in a symbolic statement of solidarity with those who are trying to stop the illegal ivory trade. Children in Hong Kong leading efforts to shut down department store ivory sections. A girl in Vermont just sent me her Facebook page this morning. She's been doing this project to ban ivory in Vermont. It's extraordinary, and it's been an extraordinarily gratifying effort. And I thought we were well on our way to addressing this issue, at least as far as the journalist is able to. And then something new happened. I was asked by the State Department to give a talk in West Africa. And I flew over to Togo and gave a talk there to the ministers
cabinet level people in Togo. It's a tiny country in the western side of Africa. And I gave a nice talk, and I was very proud of myself. I hit all the right buttons and had some nice pictures from National Geographic. And I said, are there any questions? Bang! The Minister of Security, Colonel Yark, raises his hand and he says, you know, very nice talk, thank you for coming, and why should we care? We don't have any elephants in Togo. I said, yes, you don't have any elephants in Togo, but you do have the second most important thing in Africa for an ivory trafficker. You have a way out. You are building the largest deep water port in sub-Saharan Africa. It's about to be completed. I suspect ivory traffickers are going to begin moving west. They've been moving their ivory east out of Kenya and Tanzania for decades. No one's looking at you. You're about to give them go from a garden hose to a floodgate. In the audience that day, a man who didn't say anything to me was this young man, Colonel Aoi, who's in the Narcotics Bureau in Togo. He did a very simple thing. He had been x-raying as a port official cargo coming into Togo for years. He took his x-ray machine and turned it around. And he started x-raying cargo going out. This is a single shipment of ivory that he discovered. In that clip, you see me opening the doors. This is that shipment. It is ivory hidden in the back of a timber shipment. And this young government official, hearing a story, says, I'm going to do something about it. I have in my control a scanner. And that's all it took, was a story. And he made the largest ivory seizure in African history, post the 1989 ivory ban. He also invited me over, again, to look at the evidence that they were able to seize along with these tusks. They arrested a Vietnamese businessman who had set up a timber exporting company that was using timber as a front to move ivory and other wildlife, shark fin and a number of other species. I got access to that smuggler's cell phone, and I downloaded the metadata, or I got the metadata off that phone, which gave me the latitude and longitude of photos he had taken. And I used that. I also had access to DNA analysis of the ivory in this shipment. And to my surprise, of course, none of these elephants came from Togo. There are 200 elephants in Togo. None of this ivory is Togolese elephants. It comes from elephants across Africa, from Gabon, Cameroon, but also the Central African Republic. And in fact, from a population in a little area called Zamgabai that had only been hit with poaching once in the last 10 years. And the people who attacked that population of elephants were a terrorist group called Seleka. And that was a major moment for me. That terrorism was connected to the ivory trade. And I re-looked at the work I'd been doing for the last 3 years, and I said, we're not doing enough. Let's look at these other parts. Let's look at where the violence is greatest and see what the connection between violence and wildlife exploitation is. So it's easy to find those parks. You go to Virunga, in the Congo, on the border of Rwanda, where the mountain gorillas are. This is ivory seized from the Hutu, FDLR. At the time of the Rwandan genocide, 1994, 800,000 people murdered. Many of the people involved, the Hutus involved in that genocide, have fled and live in Virunga National Park. They use the park as a hideout. And this was the beginning for me to understand that these park rangers are the only police on the ground in these places. They are not only protecting wildlife, they're protecting villagers. In many of these places, if a soldier comes towards you, that's a reason to fear. Soldiers are often corrupt, they have guns in the bush. The UN officials in Central Africa have recently been exposed as rapists. It is a very dangerous place to see an official and park rangers are the front line. This is Emmanuel Demerode, the chief officer. You may have heard of him. He's a Belgian prince. He runs Virunga National Park. He's got an incredible bloodline. He's an extraordinary man. He was National Geographic. He and his team were National Geographic Explorers of the Year last year. Last year he was ambushed by what may have been FDLR, may have been some people working for those who want to explore for oil in Virunga National Park. You may have seen the documentary Virunga. This is the guy behind that film. He was shot 6 times. This is him. Shot, this portrait is by Brent Sturton, and this is post his being shot. That's the story of Virunga. Jump to Zakuma National Park in Chad. These men were out on a hill to protect elephants. When the Janjaweed came in, they were during their morning prayers, 4:30 a.m., Muslims. Their hill is surrounded by Janjaweed poachers, and these men were shot during their prayers. These are rangers in Zakuma who go out now after the Janjaweed and others. The boy at in the T-shirt is the son of one of the men you saw in the previous portraits. This is the front line in the illegal wildlife trade. This is Garamba National Park in the Congo, right at the border of Sudan. And as I'm seeing this, and I'm going to these places, and I'm meeting these people, I'm saying, this is more than wildlife. This is a national security issue. This is this is the front line in a lot more than just an elephant question. This is terrorism, and the only reason it's not a capital T terrorism for us is that they're not affecting us. It is happening at a massive scale in Africa. This is a victim of the Lord's Resistance Army. You know the name Joseph Kony, perhaps. Is a terrorist group. It's operated out of Uganda, then Congo, then South Sudan. Now where is he? That became a target for me. I want to go after Kony. This is a victim. This woman's had her nose and lips and ears, breasts cut off by boy soldiers. And so this is a boy soldier that I interviewed during this program.
In this village, I meet this boy, Emmanuel. What was your experience with the LRA? I killed people. That's what I did. So one group was for killing people, and one group was for killing elephants, and I'm here to ask about elephants, which I know for him. Why are you talking about elephants? And he says, I wasn't part of the animal killing effort. Did you see elephants being killed? There was killing, he said to me. I understand. I'm very sorry. From his perspective, I didn't get it. This is all about killing.
That was among the most difficult things I've ever done. I was talking to a boy on an elephant project, a boy soldier who's had to kill people, and I'm talking to him about animals. And I wanted to change this. And I've been using, even before I knew it, now I understand it better, I've been using wildlife stories to get at deeper issues, to get at social ills, to get at corruption issues. And to do this, I created the Special Investigations Unit in National Geographic. And the idea of this is to not sit back as storytellers and just observe and describe what's happening in the world, but to take it forward, to drive into these criminal operations. and use story to make a difference. And, this is very serious stuff, and it's dangerous, and it matters to me, but it's also got to be fun. And in order to endure it, and so here is a scenario. I'll give you the case. I'll give you the case we faced, and then tell you how we solved this problem. So here's the scenario, and you can think about how you would address this. I took this. Remember the cell phone I described? I had the access to a photograph of a lumber yard. I know that this is a phone owned by an ivory smuggler. I know that he uses timber to cover his ivory smuggling. I suspect this photograph is of the lumber yard that he's using to move ivory through. I go to that lumber yard. This is in West Africa. It's in a very bad section of town. And I find that lumber yard is walled all the way around, too high to see over. There are no taller buildings nearby. There are no trees nearby. There are no hills. There are no direct sight lines into that lumber yard. If it were you, how would you get access to that lumber yard? And you have a drone.
Mm-hmm.
We had great intel that there's an area here in Lome that is a staging ground for both timber trade and the ivory trade. We're clear outsiders. We draw a lot of attention. Let's draw a lot of attention. Coca-Cola? We're going to do lots of candy. We're going to get these kids excited about our being there. We have a quadcopter with an HD camera attached to it. That looks like a toy. We're sharing a cultural moment with these kids. The parents are smiling. Even the guys who have menacing looks on their faces lighten up. And then let's let the quadcopter appear to get loose from us.
We might not have a lot more time. Okay. So the guys on the mic. Okay, should we go?
Lo and behold, it's going to fly over this lumber yard.
Should we go? Hold it. Bye-bye.
So that was that gave us access to that timber yard and our first look, and it also gave us a passport to come back whenever we want. These kids love us. That's the white guys with the toy. We can come back as often as we want, and that's key to this kind of work. But this is serious criminality, and how do we get into? This isn't the sort of East African criminal crime syndicate that I had understood when it came to the ivory trade. This is Central Africa, violence, where militaries there is constant civil war. How do I figure out what's going on in the ivory trade there? The idea I came up with was, let's approach this like a drug trafficking, moving cocaine out of Colombia. How would I go after that? Well, one of the ideas I would like, one of the things I'd do is I'd put a tracker either in the cocaine or in the money. So I went to one of the world's best taxidermists, George Dante, who's a taxidermist for the American Museum of Natural History, and I said, George, can you make me an elephant tusk? And George said, sure. I've made an elephant tusk before. I said, George, this has to be something that if you hold it, it's not just to look at on a trophy on the wall. If you hold it, it works. It feels like an elephant tusk. Well, no one's ever done that I know of, Brian. I said, well, at first I told him it was for a touch and feel museum, like a children's museum. We were building a geographic. I didn't want to tell him what we were doing. And then once I realized George could actually produce this thing, I told him what we were doing. And I had another engineer build me a satellite-based GPS system, and that's what he's putting inside this mold right there. And then once he pours the mold, it's permanent. Then he hand-painted it and coated it with the same coating NASCAR cars are coated with, so that they can be banged around. And then this is the result. Tell me which one is real and which one is fake. I say tell me because I cannot know. George is extraordinary. And you know, side by side, these things were perfect. And they were so perfect that I ran into a little difficulty because I had to get these to Africa. They are ivory, and I had them in my suitcase. So here's what happens.
I can't make this is not real ivory. There's this left. You see I'm facing 5 or more years in Tanzanian prison. Unfortunately, your expert refuses to look at the X-ray. Hello, this is Bryan Christy from National Geographic. If you have 240 home, personally, I am on the salon. I'm under arrest and taken to a detention center. Who is in charge of this, man? Tomorrow. But you're going to make me sleep on the floor here tonight.
Look at the floor, Mr. We have already keep this.
Myself. Okay.
In the morning, senior Tanzanian wildlife experts arrive. These are the authorities who will check out my story.
So inside is a hollow, partially hollow cavity with a radio transmitter. And it's not less. When they finally said, you know what, we believe you, you could feel the tension released from the room. They looked at me and said, you're free to go. It looks real.
So before we, humor is very important. Before we had an answer whether I was an ivory trafficker or not, well, first of all, the part that's left out of this film, my cameraman, J.J. Kelly, had an iPhone in his shirt pocket that got that video, and they arrested me, and they said, who do these belong to? I said, they're mine. And I said to him, well, you can go. He said, I'm not leaving my friend. This is my friend. Would you leave your friend? And I was very touched that he would stay in prison with me in Dar es Salaam. And then I said to him, once everything cleared up, I said, JJ, you know, thank you for staying with me. I mean, not many people. He said, are you kidding me? I wasn't going to miss that footage. So if things go bad, you want a camera, and you have a cameraman with you, make sure it's going to be good. And these guys were great. I mean, once we cleared everything up, some of these guys are my Facebook friends, and I've got some great contacts now as a result of this. And that's one life lesson that's also an investigator's lesson, and that is that there are no mistakes. This may have seemed like a major setback, spending a night in jail and things, but if you saw all the officials that came into that room, it would have taken me months to go from office to office to meet all those officials. And instead, they all came to me, I got to meet them all in one evening. So I have contacts now as a result of that that I never would have had. And that's part of driving forward constantly as an investigator. Eventually got my tusks into Central Africa, and then I sat down with a smuggler, a poacher, with the Lord's Resistance Army who had just been captured, and I debriefed him on where he had been on a poaching mission in Garamba National Park. They killed elephants, were moving the ivory out of Garamba when he defected, and I got access to him and debriefed him here.
Onan says he was abducted by the LRA when he was 22 years old, taken from his wife and daughter in the middle of the night. The LRA later returned to his home and killed his wife. Now that he's free, he has a personal stake in taking Coney down. What is the LRA doing with the money it gets from ivory? So we've heard from several LRA defectors that ivory is being carried up to Darfur. Who does Coney sell the ivory to? For the Sudanese government. It is the Sudanese armed forces. In fact, that is very clear. There are no civilian ivory traders in Darfur where they're bringing the ivory. They are Sudanese military. Coney gives the ivory to the military. What does the military give to Coney? Bombs. Michael Onan is very clear about what the LRA are doing with the ivory. They are trading it in Sudan for weapons. Flat. It is ivory for arms.
So I injected my 2 tusks with the GPS tracking system in them into the path that Onan described. And my tusks, which I followed on an iPad, followed the exact same path Onan described, out of the Congo, through the Central African Republic, through South Sudan, to a town in a small corner of Sudan called the Kapia-Kinging Enclave, where Onan told me Coney himself is. Other defectors told me Coney himself demands that ivory be brought to him. I was able to contract with a satellite to take photographs of the specific places where my tusks went, and was able to identify a clearing and watched as the ivory, with some time lapse, the ivory sat in this clearing, moved as if it had been traded, exactly as Onan describes. And then it proceeded to move further east in the direction of Khartoum. I had a satellite that stopped in a town called Ed Daim, which has an airport, and I took a satellite shot of the exact building that ivory was in. And that became the cover story this year, just last year, for National Geographic. And I think getting this story out, the work that NGOs are doing, the government officials are doing around the world, has been instrumental in changing, in a very short period of time, global policies with respect to ivory. Just last fall, President Xi of China announced China was going to close down its domestic ivory market. 7 years, just 7 years earlier, China had demanded the world allow an exception to the ivory ban to allow it to create an ivory market. 7 years ago, China built the world's largest ivory carving factory. 7 years later, it is announced it's going to shut it down. That's because of a lot of people, and it's because people are sharing the story of what's happening there. So in the end, the question really for the world is, do we want this, or do we want this? Do we want this, or do we want this? And I'll leave you with one of my favorite short clips.
I wanted to go to Kenya to relax a bit with elephants, to see the Sheltered Wildlife Trust's orphaned elephants. Now that's bittersweet in itself. These are baby elephants, which you can't help but fall in love with. These guys, Ivory Warlords. To spend time with these baby elephants is just recharges your soul. And just to have them lead me into a group of wild elephants and to be chaperoned, they are protecting me, whether they know it or not. They are protecting me as I go into this group of wild elephants. Elephants in the wild, if you don't understand them, can be extremely dangerous. And these baby elephants walk me into this herd of bulls. And I feel safe. I can walk around their mud bath. These babies, they've been released into the wild and they go back and forth. And there's sort of a transition group now between the fully wild and those that are still being hand-raised. And they introduced me to these bull elephants that were I to walk up to like this on my own, chances are very good I'd be seriously injured. And I'm just a few feet away from them. That's an extraordinary opportunity. It's recharges me, but it just reestablishes my belief that these animals live in a society we barely understand. And I don't have any greater right or lesser right to be on this planet, to have my community than these elephants do.
So every story is a gift. The stories I write and the stories I take part in are my gift to these animals and to these people who are on the ground. Sharing these stories can be your gift to them. Thank you very much.